The bullet is almost intact, only slightly flattened, with a little cone of lead missing from the rear end. Could such a bullet have penetrated successively a human neck, a human torso, a wrist, and a thigh, and emerged in this condition? The commission used animal carcasses and blocks of gelatin to test the bullet's penetrating power, firing repeated shots from Oswald's rifle. Now, this is standard technique, but because of the difficulty of lining up such a shot, the commission experts fired their bullets separately through the various simulators. And each time, they measured how much speed the bullet had lost from its initial 2,000 feet per second, and in the end, concluded that the bullet would have retained enough velocity to penetrate the governor's thigh. But it seemed to us that the only completely valid test would be a single shot directly through a series of objects with the same thickness and density as the two bodies. We decided to make that shot.
Dr. Alfred G. Olivier, Chief of Wound Ballistics at Edgewood Arsenal, who conducted the tests for the Warren Commission, served as consultant to CBS News in these experiments at the H.P. White Ballistics Laboratory. Dr. Olivier suggested using gelatin blocks to simulate human tissue. The main object was to line up targets simulating the president's neck and the governor's chest, wrist, and thigh, spaced as far apart as Mr. Zapruder's film indicated they were in the limousine, and then to see how far a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano bullet would penetrate. Extensive research at Edgewood Arsenal has shown that gelatin in a 20% concentration gives a good simulation of human tissue. The first gelatin block was made 5.5 inches thick to simulate the president's neck, with cloth added to represent his coat and shirt. Set 2 feet or so away was a 12-inch block representing the governor's chest, also with appropriate clothing. This high-speed sequence, taken at 22,000 frames a second, shows the chest simulation block, and how the bullet, slightly unstable after passing through neck simulation, begins to turn off course as it tears through the gelatin, exiting in an attitude pointing down. The wrist block was 2.5 inches thick, inset with masonite to represent bone. Beyond was a fourth gelatin target, representing the governor's thigh. Dr. Olivier told reporter Walter Lister about the tests.
When the bullet struck the simulated neck, it was perfectly stable, passed through, making a small tract in the gelatin. This very closely simulates the wound received by the president, with a small entrance and a small exit, as described on the autopsy report.
This is about the way it would look through human muscle tissue.
Yes. After the bullet left this simulated neck and passed from this dense medium into the air, which is less dense, then it had a chance to start to tip. And by the time it struck this block, it was tipped, and you can see the difference. A much larger tract in the gelatin block, which represents a more serious wound, as the governor received. In his case, the bullet passed along the rib, fractured the rib, throwing fragments into the lung. Of course, we have no rib here, but it still simulates passing through the flesh. By the time it had passed through here, it had lost considerable velocity and entered the simulated wrist. In some cases, it passed through the wrist. In other cases, it lodged in the wrist. Behind this wrist, we had another gelatin block representing the governor's thigh. In none of the cases did this thing actually penetrate that, but it would have taken very little more velocity to have caused a similar wound.
What do you think that these tests have indicated here?
Well, I think they very strongly show that this one bullet could have caused all the wounds.
Did someone outline these experiments for you?
No, I'm afraid I'm guilty of the whole business.
Our tests confirm that a single bullet could indeed have wounded both men. But conceding that it is possible, we must also ask if it is probable. First, Dr. Enos with Dan Rather.
I have had cases in which the missiles have gone through relatively heavy bone and very little deformity. The fact that it went through two men is perfectly acceptable because of its velocity.
Now, most of us have an idea that the minute a bullet hits a bone, that it shatters that bullet.
No, not necessarily. Again, it depends on the construction of the missile, of the bullet. If it's a full jacketed bullet, it can remain intact with very little or no deformity.